Hey Sis, it's a weekly shakedown of the binary walls around us.
Breaking it out and building a bridge.
Checking our biases with empathy and humility and questioning the status quo.
It's about building allyship that is intentional and confident.
Then, well, what are we going to do with housing or jobs? Are we like, how segregated is society supposed to be? And if in what we're seeing from these anti-trans advocates with the challenges that they are trying to mount to these human rights laws is in effect an argument for intense segregation throughout all aspects, like all areas of society.
Today, we are joined by Charlotte Dalwood. Charlotte uses she, her pronouns, is a commentator on Canadian constitutional law, 2S LGBTQ+ rights, and religion. She currently holds a Master of Arts in Religion with a concentration in theology from Yale University and a certificate in Anglican Studies from Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, and is currently pursuing her JD through the University of Calgary. Welcome to Hey Sis, Charlotte.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you on the show. And for those of you who are wondering a little bit more about Charlotte Dalwood, we reached out to Charlotte because we came across an article that she wrote. It was posted as an opinion piece on CBC entitled, "As Misinformation Campaigns Against Transgender Rights Intensifies, Ottawa Must Act." And we wanted to know more about that. We wanted to talk a little bit more about these misinformation campaigns, how they are affecting and hurting the trans community, and what should Ottawa be doing. So why don't we start first, Charlotte, so how was your article received by the public? Were there any comments that you received that sort of stood out the most? Was it predominantly, did you get a lot of positive feedback, or was it more of those misinformation mongers that attacked the commentary?
So the response that I received to the article was predominantly negative, which was about what I would have anticipated. One of the unfortunate realities of writing pieces in the CBC or any media platform that has a large reach is that a lot of the people who take the time to actually let you know specifically what they thought of what you've said are not saying very nice things about what you've written. Which isn't to say that that is an accurate gauge of how readers generally received the piece. Just to say that is kind of the nature of who takes the time to let you know what they themselves think. Particularly, I received a particularly strong response to the piece from the anti-trans groups that I name as examples in it. So CAUSEBAR, the Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights Organization, and We the Females, both lodged formal complaints with the CBC Ombudsman over the piece, and took to Twitter to air many of their grievances. And then earlier this week, there was it's a hit piece, really, that was published against me and the piece in this Catholic, let's see if I can get this right, traditional Catholic alt-right, well, they call themselves a news site, but that's probably generous, like conspiracy site, which was also, again, just an example of the kind of people who take the time to mention you specifically and make sure you know exactly what they think, not being necessarily like the friendliest folks. So those have been kind of the responses that have been brought to my attention, which I don't think are representative of how an average reader would have received the piece.
No, I think that doesn't surprise me, probably doesn't surprise Isaac either. And I think it's good for people to know when it comes to, articles around transgender, you've got to really look to the source and not the comments. And that sort of around that whole misinformation disguised as fact that is out there that is really kind of harming human rights and protected rights for trans people in our communities.
To kind of Cindy's point there, I think it's kind of like most reviews for like restaurants. The only people that give reviews are going to be negative reviews. And the same thing with articles. The only comments you're going to see are going to be people with negative comments, which is the unfortunate aspect of a lot of advocacy work, because people, who either are allies or part of the community, they very rarely comment on stuff like that. They usually share it and they support it within their own circles, but they're not open about supporting it, which is really hard for someone like yourself who is very well spoken and does a lot of commentary work. You don't get to see kind of the positive, actions afterwards of those types of articles. You just see the negative and all the fear mongering and people taking it and spinning it in their own direction and using that as a different narrative. So.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I think, why one of the things I really love is when people actually reach out to me directly to let me know what they think. And one of the tricks that I really picked up in grad school, actually, to deal with this sort of feedback bias towards, hearing mostly negative feedback to what you write and put out there, is to create a special folder in your email inbox. A friend of mine calls it a good vibes folder, where you basically save nice things that people have said. So when when you've written something that is getting mostly negative feedback, you can go and read these, rare but really often quite touching letters and emails that, people send you saying nice things. It can be very affirming.
I love that. I love that. I'm going to do that. I'm going to make one later this morning. So for those who maybe did not have the opportunity to read the article, and we will post a link on our blog to the article so you can check it out. But maybe, Charlotte, can you explain about the gray area in our current legislation, and what role does the Supreme Court currently have?
Yeah, absolutely. So I basically make 3 points in the article. The first point, and something that I really want listeners to take away, is that under the current law, trans people have very strong and very established and very well-defined rights and protections. They have rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the equality provision. It says everyone is equal under and before the law and prohibits discrimination from government on the basis of sex. And that includes trans people. Courts have been very clear on this. There's not a lot of ambiguity there. Trans people also have very strong protections under provincial and federal human rights legislation, which tend to actually specify gender and gender identity as areas that of deserving special protection. So that's the first takeaway, is that these rights and protections are very strong. They're very established. Courts have been consistent in interpreting them as protecting trans people. So that leads to the second point, which is this misinformation campaign that I touch upon. So you ask about the gray area in Canadian law. The reality is there isn't one, but there are these anti-trans advocacy groups that are trying to create it. So I named some of the groups in the article, but one of the key arguments that we are seeing from anti-trans advocates right now is this idea that Canadian law, and specifically the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, only or protects cis women's rights to sex-segregated spaces, so spaces where they can be free of trans people, because in the Charter it only guarantees equality on the basis of sex. And so the idea being that doesn't include gender. Sex and gender are distinct, and so cis women have this sex-based right, as people assigned female at birth, to sex segregation, to female-only bathrooms, to female-only women's shelters, etc., etc. So this idea that then legislation that, like human rights legislation that protects gender identity is actually unconstitutional because it violates this sex-based right. So therefore you could challenge, for instance, the Alberta Human Rights Act, which does protect against discrimination on the basis of gender and gender identity on the basis that it actually violates cis women's right to non-discrimination on the basis of sex. So that's this attempt to create a gray area. A lot of the advocacy has kind of constellated around prisons and the Correctional Service of Canada's policy of taking people's gender identities into account when deciding where to house them. So I mentioned this idea of sex-segregated spaces. So we are seeing a number of protests at prisons across the country, small but recurrent, which are claiming that cis women inmates' right to sex-segregated prison spaces is being violated by having trans women housed in women's prisons. And so that speaks to this, what I think, like, in these prison protests, I think we see very clearly what these anti-trans advocates mean by sex segregation. Quite literally, different spaces where you have walled off from one another, where you have cis women can congregate without men, without trans women, and they claim this is basically a constitutional right.
Okay, so, and it's basically then on the grounds that they're not accepting that trans women are women. I can think to one example recently too, where my daughter lifeguards at a swimming pool, and there were a group of cis women that were, particular, like it was a special sort of a women's only swim time. And there was several women there that got very upset that there was a trans woman there swimming. And we had a lot of dialogue around that, on how they were able to support the trans women who had every right to be there. But I guess that's what you're speaking to as well, that and domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters for the evening, trying to break it down so that trans women maybe have nowhere to go.
Yeah, it's everything. I mean, those are some specific examples. Washrooms, change rooms, prisons. These are kind of some specific spaces where a lot of this anti-trans sentiment and anti-trans advocacy kind of focuses. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the human rights legislation that is being challenged here protects people from discrimination in all facets of life. So, for example, like one of the kind of two key areas where human rights legislation protects people is in housing, so landlord-tenant relationships, and in employment, hiring, employment practices, and so on. So if this legislation, these protections are indeed unconstitutional, then the kind of extension of that is that, well, then trans people do not, in fact, have a right to be free from discrimination when they go to rent a home, when they go to apply for a job, that, in fact, it is people's constitutional right to discriminate against trans people in order to preserve sex segregation. And that's one of the extensions, which, it's, I think when we talk about bathrooms, change rooms, prisons, etc., it's kind of easy to think that, well, we could just create more spaces. We can just have non-gendered washrooms or change rooms, for instance, so you can still have sex segregation where all the trans people go to the unisex bathrooms, and then we have women's bathrooms that are for cis women and men's bathrooms for cis men. And there's lots of problems with that view.
Building full of washrooms.
Exactly. But then you think, okay, well, even if we were to accept that's okay, and that's the, kind of upshot of this sex segregation proposal, then, well, what are we going to do with housing or jobs? Are we like, how segregated is society supposed to be? And if in what we're seeing from these anti-trans advocates with the challenges that they are trying to mount to these human rights laws is, in effect, an argument for intense segregation throughout all aspects, like all areas of society.
I have a million thoughts going through my head, and I'm just wondering, and you might know this, you might not know, Charlotte, but has there actually ever been a case in Canada where a trans woman has like murdered or attacked or sexually assaulted somebody in a bathroom? Or, that's the thing. Like, it's the whole fixation on that segregation. That I actually don't think, and I've tried to look this up before, but there's where a trans person has just been using a space that actually there has been an incident of violence or harassment or something at the cis person. It's usually directed back at the trans person because of this misinformation.
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of all of the criminal charges that may or may not have been laid against people in Canada. From my own kind of reading of some of this anti-trans publications, is often the examples of harassment and attacks are of cis men committing the violence, which we know is statistically what tends to happen. There are many problems with these narratives of the violent trans woman, which are of course an extension of the kind of arguments against cis gays and lesbians that we saw in 70s, 80s, and so on. But for instance, you'll see this narrative or this claim at some of these, like for instance the prison protests. Trans. What is it? It'll go something to the effect of transgender sex offenders are being housed in this women's prison, and I hate to tell you, but so are cis women sex offenders, because that is where we house women offenders. So it is it's both the case that I think that these claims are certain of the violent trans women are certainly overblown. They're a transphobic talking point. And it's the case that we should also have the integration of trans women with cis women in prisons, in change rooms, in employment, even if there are individual bad actors. That in and of itself is not a reason to kind of forcibly segregate these societies, because of course the reality is that there are going to be individuals who do bad things for any number of reasons. And we can talk about the social reasons that lead to people committing crimes, but the point being that point is A, wrong, and B, also not a reason to segregate society.
Yeah. And to your point exactly, is that we're at a point where we're trying to socially break down barriers and break down walls, but there's so many groups that are hyperfixated on terminology and labels. And while they might be important on one hand, I know I can name so many different articles that I've just scrolling through, I've seen that, it says like trans woman or trans man or non-binary person automatically in the article title. And I'm like, I know right off the bat, there's a bias there, because there's no reason why you need to hyper-specify what this person's gender identity is, or what their sexuality is, or what their race is, or ethnicity. There's no reason to do that. So, there's a lot of articles out there who are already feeding that kind of fear-mongering and that hate that people have, because you can just search, you can go into Google and search, angry trans woman, and you'll find thousands of articles, and it's awful. So to segue kind of from that point there, in your opinion and your expertise, who, and I guess more what, is kind of motivating or feeding these groups to target commentators or trans people, in your opinion?
I think that there are a couple of reasons. As always, it's a complex issue. One of the very specific reasons that they are growing is, frankly, that anti-trans activism is being exported to Canada from the United Kingdom, and increasingly it's being exported from the United States. And related to that, we have the kind of dark side of the internet, which is the ability, the ability that the internet gives people to organize across national boundaries, certainly across provincial boundaries, so that people can find other people who think the way they do and can feed into their view of the world. And this is helping these anti-trans narratives to come over from particularly the United Kingdom. So for instance, the groups that I watch, and a couple of them I mentioned in the article again, if you go on their Twitter feeds, you'll see a lot of British media being reposted, being shared, and at the present state, the United Kingdom, British media is horribly and, dominantly anti-trans. So if we're seeing those so that's where they're getting a lot of these views confirmed. And then related to that, and this is something that particularly interests me as someone in law, is that Canadian law is in some ways uniquely complicated, particularly Canadian constitutional law. So in the United States, you have the American Constitution, and famously, for example, you right to bear arms, and you just open the Constitution and you look at it and you say, right to bear arms, great, I'm going to go get a weapon. This is, but it's this kind of like it's almost self-interpreting. It's very plain. It's very readable. The Canadian Constitution is not like that. So you open the Charter and you go to the equality provision. Okay, everyone is equal under and before the law, and protected from discrimination, particularly on the basis of, among other things, sex. And you say, well, I know what sex is, so I know what the Charter applies to. But that's not how you read the Charter from a legal perspective. That's not actually how, when we're doing law, or when courts are deciding rights or deciding, whether legislation is constitutional or not, that's not how they're going to do it. And it's not self-interpreting. You need to understand the case precedent. You need to understand some of these unwritten principles of how courts read the Constitution. For example, in Canadian law, we have constitutional law, we have something called analogous grounds, which basically means that, so the Charter lists all of these protected grounds, so you can't be discriminated on certain areas, and the courts say, well, if something isn't written specifically in there, that's okay. If we can find something else that's analogous to one of the written grounds, we'll say that's protected too. Marital status is there's some famous cases where the courts have read things into the Charter. So what this means is that even if people are, trans people are not protected against discrimination just on the sex grounds, which the courts have consistently said they are, the courts could say, well, but gender is analogous to sex in a legal sense, so we're just going to read it in. That's not a problem. We do this all the time. Canadian Constitution includes unwritten elements, so that's okay. You need to know this. But for the average layperson who doesn't have this legal training, that's not going to be clear at all. They're not going to know that at all. And so groups, these anti-trans groups, what they're able to do is they're able to say, okay, you are concerned, person in the world, Canadian in the world, you're concerned about your rights as a woman. You're concerned about safety, etc. Well, just go read the Charter yourself. You'll see that it only protects on the basis of sex, but then go read the human rights legislation. Well, you'll see that it says gender. Well, those are different terms. Clearly, they're referring to different things. And by encouraging these people to basically go and do their own research, they're able to actually tap into ignorance and capitalize on it, so that then they can recruit people to their movement, and they can say, well, you've seen that it refers to sex. Clearly this is the way it is. And they take what is a complex issue and they simplify it in order to sell their anti-trans talking points. And that's a problem. And it's a problem that I think as people in law, we really need to solve, because in order to prevent these groups from continuing to expand, continuing to recruit more members, one of the key things that needs to happen is that the wider public just needs to be educated about some of the nuances of how the laws that govern their lives actually work.
Yeah.
Well, so is it fear though? Like if we look about so we know that they're doing it, but I mean, I know it's hard to hypothesize, but it seems like a lot of it is really grounded in fear. It's kind of, I mean, it's sad. It's sad. I just can't figure out the why, and even J.K. Rowling, like when you mentioned the UK, huge with, Harry Potter, and, a lot of people don't realize that, she's totally in that sort of turf zone of not accepting trans women as being women. And you think, educated, knowledgeable people would be a little bit more open to understanding the complexities of biology.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, I want to acknowledge that I think people's reasons for embracing any ideological position are often deeply personal, so it's hard to generalize. On the other hand, I think that if we were to speak about some generalities that account for a lot of people, a lot of people's adherence to anti-trans positions and then their involvement in anti-trans advocacy, I do think a lot of it stems from fear, and I think related is that I think a lot of it stems from trauma. So the unfortunate reality in our world today is that there is an incredible amount of male or violence that men commit against women, and it's incredibly normalized. And this is indeed, the world that people are inhabiting. And so if we're talking about what is the, attraction of anti-trans advocacy for cis women, I think a big part of it is rooted in this quite justifiable fear and anger, of and anger at men. And so this is why we have this I think a lot of the fear constellates around trans women and the dangers that they supposedly pose to cis women in these in shelters, in prisons, in change rooms, etc. Is because it's this fear of what men will do to women in those spaces, which is often too often commit violence. And so if you have this fear and you really want to protect yourself, you want to protect your community, and you want against the intrusion of violent men into your spaces, well, to do what anti-trans activists often do, which is to say, well, then every person born with a penis is unwelcome here, because every person born that way is an inherent threat. And so in a lot of ways, I have a great deal of sympathy for people who hold this position, because I think a lot of it's rooted in fear and the trauma that many women, have experienced at the hands of men. That doesn't justify it, but I think that's where a lot of it does come from on a very personal level for people.
Yeah, no, very, very true, and very well said too, because I think it's key that we focus that the root issue is kind of the systematic oppression that so many women across the globe have been put through, and that though there are certain women who have experienced trauma or have experienced marginalization or anything of that sort, and they can't pivot their brain away from the aspect of someone, to be frank, having a penis. And that's what they root that the patriarchy and the marginalization to, is that aspect, not the person that has that genitalia. Trans women are women, and they can't discern between a trans woman and a man. And that's the root cause. And it's horrible and awful. And
I think that a lot, like the weaponization of the penis. And it's, it happens in as young as, in elementary school, in primary, in grade 1 with young trans youth, other, little girls have come up to, trans girls and said, you can't use this washroom, and they're 6 years old. And it's like, what? It's that, it is trickling down. So
it's taught at a really young age too.
It is.
So I have one other quick question, and it's definitely a loaded question. So I apologize in advance. But this is something that so as a trans person myself, I have been teetering around a lot with, and I'm not too sure how to approach it. So I'm wondering, with your expertise, more particularly in the law side of things, kind of how you would tackle this. So this is my question. So what are your thoughts on political parties, and more specifically, the People's Party of Canada, whose political platform was built on the idea of freedom of expression, in air quotes, because it's their own interpretation of the legislature. And one of their end goals being to destroy Bill C-6 and similar bills that make hate speech illegal. Is there any comments you want to add around there?
So the People's Party of Canada is an unfortunate political development in Canada. It is unfortunately part of a larger trend that we are seeing in Western democracies towards these populist far-right movements kind of emerging on the political stage as viable either political parties like the People's Party, or converting other parties, like in the United States, converting viable political parties into, vehicles for them to seize power. It's bad. It's problematic. With respect to some of the specific proposals that the People's Party of Canada is putting forward, I think they should be opposed. I think that one of the things that needs to happen. So what we are seeing right now is far-right organizing around a number of issues, be it rolling back or preventing the development of hate speech protections, to rolling back human rights protections for trans people, and so on. Like we're seeing this on a number of issues, and the organizing has been fairly effective, and now that they are increasingly organized, they're mobilizing into political action. I think that this should be a call to action for, I want to say people on the left because that's where I am, but I suppose people on the center too, who say returning to trans rights. So for people who are supporters of trans rights, who don't want to see the normalization of anti-trans speech, of anti-trans talking points in Canadian society, I think that it's well past time for us to organize ourselves, organize and mobilize, in order to be able to ensure that our voices are heard on the political stage with at least as much, if not hopefully much more force than these far-right groups like the People's Party, People Party of Canada, voices is being heard. So they're bad policies, but they are, I think, they do provide a lesson, even for people like me who are, quite strongly opposed to them, of the necessity of action.
I appreciate that. Yeah. And I think just with the most recent election, they've been definitely at the forefront of a lot of folks' mind, especially here in Atlantic Canada. There's a lot of folks in New Brunswick who, whatever reason, voted for them. But I think it's just because they were pushing so much to be anti-mask, kind of drawing on those very far right ideologies, which a lot of folks grabbed on. But I don't know personally, because I definitely don't want these people in my circle, but I have friends of friends who, they were saying, oh, I love trans people, like I'm an ally, and then their Facebook is just riddled with like PPC, I call it memorabilia or whatever you want to call it. And it's just funny because so many people, they focus on one issue and they don't look at the entire party involved. And yeah, and looking at it myself, I don't know if you can comment on this by any means, Charlotte, so I don't want to put pressure on you, but it feels very unconstitutional, and it feels very, very illegal that they're able to kind of use that as a platform when these are things that are in our human rights codes. These are things that are in our legislature that shouldn't be able to be touched and shouldn't be able to be changed or used as a platform or stepping tool for parties. You would have hoped that Canada would be beyond that by now, especially what we've witnessed in the UK and the US. But, here we are. But I think, knock on wood, that they're only kind of at the forefront of things this most recent election because of the mask mandate, and that they're very much going to fall behind in coming years. But yeah, it's my little mini commentary.
I mean, one of the key things to take away from this sort of the rise of the far right in Canada and elsewhere is that laws are only as strong as, the people who uphold them.
True.
So protections for trans rights, are only strong if legislatures keep them intact, if courts, uphold them as protecting trans people, if people are willing to bring complaints about anti-trans discrimination to the attention of, the legal system, among others. And I think it's a there's this danger, particularly for people, I think, of a more liberal persuasion who have a lot of faith in government, to become complacent and to say, well, we have these protections, we're good. We're not good. We are in I think on a dangerous trajectory, but we're not so far along, that it's not possible to, prevent Canada from going the way of the United Kingdom or the United States on any number of these issues. But the time to act is right now. The time to ensure that good, clear resources are available to the public to limit their willingness to be recruited into these far-right movements, to make sure those resources are available now. And to be working in our local communities to basically, counter these far-right talking points as they come up.
That's the whole purpose of what we do at Simply Good Form, for sure. And it, it is so important. I would love to see more trans women specifically running in our, political elections. I would really love to see more voices within legislature and within the government. And so for cis people, we want to let, cis people that are listening, like what can they do? How can they help? And then I'd also like to throw out, for trans people, if we could speak to, a trans person in the workplace, somebody is constantly misgendering them. Now you go through your HR and your policies, but if you find that you're not being supported, or even a person in power is kind of rolling their eyes and not taking it seriously, is your only recourse to take out a long drawn out human rights complaint? Or could you actually go to the police and say, are there protections there, like right away that they would have, basically?
Yeah. Okay. So, there are a couple questions there. So I'll start with the kind of what cis people should do. And I think it's fairly, simple for me. Is that what needs to happen in Canada now is that, it's critical because we're at this relatively early stage of, anti-trans organizing and activism here. It's critical to blunt the ability of these anti-trans groups to recruit more members. And I think that one of the key ways to do that is basically, education. Right now, I think Canada's a fertile field for anti-trans recruiting because for all the reasons that I said earlier about how complicated our law is. I think it's important for cis people to educate themselves, but particularly to be listening to trans people who are already putting out the resources, to go to these reliable educate themselves from reliable sources, basically, so that when these anti-trans activists encourage them to educate themselves in unreliable ways, these cis people can already recognize these anti-trans talking points for what they are, which is misinformation. So I think that's key.
But it is hard, isn't it? Because you have that book that was say published by Abigail Schreier, and there was a big uproar here. We don't want it in the libraries because it's in a resource section within the libraries. And I think they've been very good about trying to put up information that this is not educational. This is not to be used as an educational resource, but under the freedom of expression, they have to carry this book that is totally transphobic and very harmful for parents trying to figure out how to support their trans children.
Yeah, it's tough. Like I want, on the one hand, I want to say educate yourselves. On the other hand, I don't, because it's exactly that kind of talking point that leads people to become anti-trans activists, because there's a lot of bad ways to educate yourself. So I would maybe if, for as kind of like a quick takeaway for cis people, educate yourselves by listening to trans people, because a lot of these resources are out there. Now, not every trans person is like a reliable talking point. There was that counterpoint maybe to my article that the CBC published like a week and a half later from a trans woman, which was fairly transphobic. So it does happen. But nonetheless, there are some in Canada, some great trans people, trans women specifically, who are, being very open about what needs to happen, about what cis people should know. So I would say listen to trans people.
I'll just jump on that really quickly too. Like, listen to trans people, number one, and then maybe go to places like Egal Canada or PFLAG Canada has a lot of great volunteers that are great to provide information. And then there's, I guess, provincially run really good to us LGBTQ plus support groups. So maybe if you're looking for information, check out their websites, because they normally have a lot of really great resources, and even the Human Rights Campaign, their website.
As another resource, I would add Wisdom to Action, which is actually based in Halifax, but is partially run by an Ontario trans woman who's doing wonderful work on trans inclusion specifically. So that's another, because part of the problem with looking at just 2S LGBTQ organizations generally is they don't always have the resources dealing specifically with trans issues. So this is a wonderful organization to get those kinds of specific resources.
Thank you. I actually didn't know about them. I think for me as a parent, when my child first transitioned, and like that was my, basically my big light bulb moment, and realizing it was just that as a Canadian, and I don't know a lot about law. I didn't go to law school, and I was just shocked, because I thought, well, okay, I understand. Yeah, my child is trans, and I love them, and I'm going to support them. So then I find out, well, we have all these supports that are in the Human Rights Code and all of that. But then there's that disconnect that they weren't protected in school, and that there weren't proper policies, and people, so I kind of thought, how is it that this has happened, that we're not educating and we're not talking and basically letting, trans youth be invisible, and yet we have these protections. And I felt so let down as a Canadian. Like, I felt angry and let down, and then also naive that, it's like kind of, shame, like guilt, that it's like, wow, like, how didn't I get myself aware around this? How did I let myself not know, because I could have made life probably a lot better for my kid when they were, a little bit younger. And I'm grateful that, they're great and they have a wonderful life right now. But there's just, so many children that are still there and existing and having, parents that don't support them because of this misinformation that's out there. And it's doing a lot of harm to our youth, to our children, to our trans community. And it's really, like we said here, it's really important that, as cis people listening, like, take an interest.
I don't want to draw on too much on this, but I think as Canadians, we get too focused on hyper-focused on our neighbors. So we're like, oh, the US is doing really bad at this, but we're fine over here. UK is doing really bad at this, but we're okay here. But oh my goodness, like systematic transphobia, systematic racism, police brutality, all that exists here. We're just very, very good at hiding it. So that's why we need more people like yourself, Charlotte, who is willing to take the brute force, unfortunately, of these anti-trans and extremely hateful campaigns that are trying to skew the narrative. And we need more people like yourself, especially cisgender people who, I hate using the term of vested interest in the community, but people who are allies who don't have personal experiences as trans people, who are willing to kind of be the forefront and take those take that heat because, as a trans person, it's a lot of work to sit and talk about your own experiences and to talk about, this, everything that you've had to go through to get to where you are today. And then also to, share such an intimate story about yourself or your own experiences in a public platform, to have a bunch of cis straight white people come at you and try and deplatform you for just sharing your experiences or your opinions on things. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, we hope that you'll keep writing, and we thank you for it, and share it with us. Like and it's great because then these conversations are really good, because when I read an article like that, I know it's important and I try to get what I can from it. But I sometimes, I think breaking it down like this, having this dialogue and this conversation is so important to really understand the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm, happy to be writing, and I'm glad to have people like you to be in conversation with. So thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast.
Appreciate it a lot. Yeah, anytime at all.
Well, that's all the time we have today, folks. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Hey Sis.
If you have any questions you want to ask or want to join in on the conversation, email us at connect@simplygoodforum.com.
Thank you all, and remember, inclusion matters.